For nearly 80 years, Elisabeth Kalhammer, an Austrian woman who worked as a maid in Adolf Hitler's private residence, remained silent about her experiences at the heart of the Third Reich. Hired in 1943 as a teenager, Kalhammer answered a job ad, unaware that she would end up cleaning the floors of one of Nazi Germany's most feared locations, the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine fortress in Bavaria. Years later, as an elderly woman, she declared, "Before I die, I must speak." And so she did. What she revealed was disturbing. Secret midnight meetings, silent disappearances of staff, whispered orders, and an atmosphere marked by fear. She was warned from the start, "Don't speak about what you see, or you will disappear like so many others." She couldn't look Hitler in the eye and claimed that his presence could be felt even without entering the room. While Europe burned, she made tea and swept the halls decorated with stolen art just feet away from those making decisions about invasions and exterminations. Today, the world finally hears her voice. Elisabeth Kalhammer, the young Austrian secretary at the Berghof. When Elisabeth Kalhammer was hired as a domestic servant at the Berghof, Adolf Hitler's residence in Obersalzberg, she was barely 22 years old. Born in 1923 in Salzburg, Austria, her life had not been particularly politicized. She belonged to a modest family and, like many young women of her time, was raised under the constant influence of the National Socialist regime, although without fervent affiliation or marked ideological background. She had completed a commercial training course and was looking for work when, in 1943, she was informed that female staff was required at an important residence in the Bavarian Alps. She was not initially told that the workplace would be the Führer's private residence. Discretion was absolute, and candidates were not allowed to ask too many questions. It was her mother who signed the consent form for her to accept the position, and only after she was admitted was she officially informed that she would be working for Adolf Hitler. Her arrival at the Berghof was, in her words, shocking. "We didn't really know what to expect," she would recount decades later. The structure dominated the mountainside, offering spectacular views of the Alps, and operated as a closed universe with a strict organization. Kalhammer joined a group of around 20 young women, all employed in administrative tasks, cleaning or cooking. Her role was primarily that of an office assistant, typist, and logistical support for the daily management of the residence. She didn't have constant access to Hitler, but she saw him almost daily as he would often wander the halls, give instructions, or appear at meals. One of her first impressions was the contrast between Hitler's public image as a powerful leader and the almost domestic nature he displayed at the Berghof. In her words, "He was surprisingly kind in his everyday dealings. He never shouted or raised his voice. He behaved toward us with a courtesy that no one expected." Throughout her stay, she observed Hitler's meticulous habits. She always dressed soberly inside the residence, wearing comfortable but neat clothes. She ate light meals, usually vegetarian dishes, and often held long evening conversations with her closest collaborators. Among them were Martin Bormann, Eva Braun, and occasionally Albert Speer. Kalhammer never witnessed political decisions or war discussions, but she noticed the growing tension as the war progressed. In 1943, there was still a certain calm at the Berghof, but in 1944, the atmosphere changed. It became more serious, more closed off. One of the most striking aspects of her accounts is her description of Eva Braun. Kalhammer was one of the few employees who had direct visual contact with her, although not a close personal relationship. She described her as a reserved woman, very concerned about her appearance, who rarely interacted with the lower staff. In a 2014 interview, Kalhammer stated, "Eva Braun had no authority over anyone. She didn't even seem very interested in exercising any power role. She was like a figurehead, but Hitler treated her with great affection." According to Kalhammer, the female presence at the Berghof was greater than many believe. The women worked in the kitchen, laundry, and administrative offices, and many of them were very young, mostly Austrian and South German. None were party members, and all knew they were to maintain complete confidentiality. The training included a key warning: never ask questions, never express political opinions, and never initiate conversation with Hitler unless he did so first. Although Elisabeth Kalhammer was not part of the Führer's inner circle, she recalls having several brief encounters with him. Some were banal exchanges, other times she directly received a work order or a directive. One of the moments that most affected her was an occasion when Hitler entered the office and personally thanked her for her work. He walked in, stood in front of me and said, "Good work. I've heard you're very efficient." I felt completely paralyzed. It was impossible not to feel the weight of who he was. She also recalls his presence on several nights when films were being shown. Hitler had a private cinema at the Berghof and enjoyed watching films, many of them German or captured Swedish and American productions, accompanied by Eva Braun and his aides. The technical staff and some secretaries were allowed to attend. Elisabeth attended on several occasions, but recalls the atmosphere as more solemn than festive. It wasn't fun. It was like attending a ritual. No one laughed, no one spoke. You could tell everyone wanted to please him. As the Eastern Front crumbled and Allied bombing intensified, the Berghof ceased to be a peaceful refuge. In 1944, Kalhammer noticed an increase in visits from high-ranking military officials, and the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Although the employees were not informed of news from the front, rumors circulated. The postal service slowed, and restrictions became stricter. In the spring of 1945, the Berghof was evacuated. Kalhammer was sent back to Salzburg just before Allied forces began bombing the area. Shortly after, the Berghof was partially destroyed by British air raids and subsequently demolished by American forces to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi sanctuary. After the war, Elisabeth Kalhammer remained silent for decades about her experience at the Berghof. Not because she feared reprisals, but because she didn't feel her role had been historically significant. Furthermore, the stigma of having served in Hitler's private residence was difficult to overcome in post-war Austria. She worked as a teacher and later as a travel agent. It was only in her old age, already retired, that she began to recount her memoirs and participated in several television interviews, mainly in Germany and Austria, between 2005 and 2018. In one of them, for the German channel ZDF, she explained, "For a long time I wondered whether I should say something. But then I thought, if people like me don't tell what it was really like, others will make up stories." Her testimony stands out for its measured tone. Kalhammer doesn't seek to justify or accuse. She simply describes what she saw and experienced without drama or omissions. "I didn't see crimes, I didn't see violence, but I did see how a regime could wrap everything in an aura of order, cleanliness, and efficiency. And behind that facade, the horror of the outside world was hidden." Elisabeth Kalhammer lived to 96. She died in 2023, leaving behind an unusual legacy of oral memory, that of someone who worked very closely with Hitler without being an accomplice or direct victim, and who knew how to maintain the emotional distance necessary to recount her experience clearly. In her recent interviews, she reiterated that she didn't regret telling her story. "It was only 1 year of my life, but it's lived with me for all the rest." Trudel Gunga, the secretary who was meant to be Hitler's heir. Trudel Gunga was born in Munich in March 1920 under the name Gertraud Humps. She would go down in history with her name shortened to her married name. She had wanted to be a dancer, but was not accepted at the academy. While studying typing, she enlisted like so many others in the Hitler Youth. At 22, she was offered a job at the seat of government. When she arrived at the chancellery, she was surprised. The Führer himself interviewed her. He asked her age and some personal background. He made a face of disgust when he learned she wasn't married. "I don't usually hire single young women, then they get married and leave." She responded quickly and submissively, "My Führer, I've already lived 22 years without a man. That's not a problem for me." He then reassured her and told her that everyone makes mistakes and that she would be no exception. He asked her to put a sheet of paper in the typewriter and began to dictate. Trudel was so nervous that she typed any letter, almost every word containing a mistake. An aide-de-camp interrupted the dictation. Hitler had come for an urgent consultation. This fortuitous incident may have saved Trudel's job and at the same time doomed her for the rest of her life. The young woman had time to correct each of her mistakes, and when Hitler re-entered the room, the sheet of paper was pristine. She was hired that same afternoon. Hitler immediately resolved the issue of the spinsterhood of the youngest of his secretaries. He introduced her to an officer who worked there, Hans Junga, and urged them to marry. They both obeyed. A few months later, Hans was sent to the front. He died sometime later in combat in Normandy. After the defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler stopped sharing meals with officers and ministers. He didn't want them to talk to him about problems. He didn't want to hear the truth. So he ate his 4 meals a day with each of his secretaries. They talked to him about the movies they were seeing, passed on gossip, and flattered him. Trudel Junga emphasized that Hitler had 2 personalities, and that both she and the rest of his female circle only ever saw his kind and charming side. This circle of women included his 3 other secretaries: Eva Braun, the wife of his personal physician, Annie Brandt; Maria von Below, the wife of one of his military advisors; and Margaret, the wife of Albert Speer. In her memoirs, she recalls, "I have to admit it, I was fascinated by Hitler. He was a kind boss and even a father figure. I deliberately ignored all the warning signs and voices that arose within me, and I enjoyed being with him almost until the very end." Hitler's secretary maintained that her boss had a unique, hypnotic power of attraction. It would be insufficient to define it as charisma, but something more. And it wasn't just her youth that had made her fall under that influence, but the generals and ministers felt the same way and couldn't contradict him. In her memoirs, Trudel recalls a particularly happy day, July 20th, 1944. That day, an attempt had been made on Hitler's life. The secretaries heard the news and went to meet him with fear. Hitler's appearance was almost pathetic. His hair was standing on end, disheveled, his eyes were wild, his face was dirty, his trousers were in tatters. But there was no worry on his face. He was exultant. He believed that having survived was a sign that everything would be fine, that it was proof that he was on the right path, that he was indestructible. "Fate has protected me. It's a sign that I must see my mission through to the end," he said. A visit from Mussolini was scheduled that afternoon. Not only did he not cancel it, but, euphoric, he took the Duce to the scene of the attack to show him how he had survived. In January 1945, Trudel entered the bunker with the Führer. He wouldn't leave until the end of the war. The atmosphere in the bunker was unreal. The stale air, the illusion of a normal everyday life, the confinement, the disconnection from reality. In the last few days, to make matters worse, everything happened with the thunderous sound of bombs falling on Berlin in the background. On April 22nd, after a meeting with generals and his trusted men, Hitler seemed to accept reality for the first time. When he left, he was dejected. He gathered the women and told them they were defeated. He urged them to escape, saying that he, in the meantime, was going to shoot himself. Eva Braun approached him and kissed him on the mouth. It was the first time that had happened in public. "I'm staying," she said. Trudel repeated the same thing, almost without thinking, without pain, without despair, without knowing why she had said it. Perhaps because she couldn't imagine where else she could go, couldn't imagine life without war, without Hitler. "I wish my generals had your courage," said the Führer. The next day, Hitler distributed cyanide pills to those who remained with him underground. After his marriage to Eva Braun, everything happened like a nightmare. They seemed like scenes from an out-of-sync movie. There was a celebration, a sad toast. Magda Goebbels paced like a ghost. The woman rejected every offer she received to take her children away from there and bring them to safety. "I'd rather they die here than survive in the indignity of a defeated Germany," she would say. She would then poison and kill all 6 of them before committing suicide herself. During those hours, men who had never even dared to look up in front of Hitler commented loudly on what he said and smoked in his presence, as if he were no longer there. Some even dared to joke. "When the Führer passes, we must hold our heads high, as long as we have them." We were no longer capable of normal feelings. All we thought about was death. When Hitler and Eva would die, when they would die, when the 6 children who lived with us would be murdered, and, naturally, when and how we would die. Hitler called Trudel into his office. He asked her how she felt, if she needed anything. "I'm going to dictate something to you. Are you ready to take notes?" Before she could answer, he began to dictate. Solemnly and without further explanation, he gave the title of the document, "My Testament." The secretary took a few seconds before she began to hit the keys. She stared at him, then she fell into step with the Führer's words. He was less frantic than usual. There was only defeat in his dull voice. but not even in his final moments did he regain his senses. At that moment, I believed I would be the first person on earth who would understand why all this was necessary, that I would say something that would explain it, justify it, teach us something. But my God, when he began to dictate the list of ministers he was designating to succeed his government in such a grotesque manner, I thought the whole situation was very undignified. He repeated the same phrases again, in his usual tone, calmly, and to finish, he once again used those terrible words to refer to the Jews. After all that despair, all the suffering, he didn't have a single word of compassion or pain. After Hitler's suicide, Trudel left the bunker accompanied by other survivors. For the first time, she saw destroyed Berlin. The columns of smoke, the rubble, the destroyed streets and buildings, the stench of death, the hunger on every corner. Neither she nor Hitler nor anyone in their entourage had ever seen a demolished city. We traveled with the blinds down, on special trains across Germany. And when we arrived in Berlin at night, the driver looked for the blocks that were as undamaged as possible. And we spent the last 4 months in the bunker. She walked like a zombie. Everything seemed strange, alien to her. Old people crying, children running or climbing over a mountain of remains from a house, women with their clothes torn off, dumped on a corner, several corpses per block, mutilated arms and legs, people who had aged suddenly. She walked to who knew where. She had nothing, except for a cyanide pill in her pocket. Another of the secretaries was caught by the Soviets and raped for several days. Otto Gunga escaped to the western sector but had to return and was captured by the Red Army. She didn't say what happened during those days of detention. She was later taken into British hands, where she was interrogated exhaustively about her relationship with Hitler and life in the bunker. She was one of the direct sources used by historian Hugh Trevor Roper to determine that Hitler had committed suicide. In 1947, she was denazified. Trudel avoided mentioning her wartime activities. She returned to work as a secretary and later joined a publishing house. Twice she tried to move to Australia with her sister, but the authorities there rejected her because of her Nazi past. The rest of her life was a constant struggle to hide, to avoid accusations, to understand how she had acted, to deny what she had seen. She struggled with her own contradictions, with history, with the weight of having lived alongside a monster and not having seen it. In 2002, she published Until the Last Moment, her memoirs. This nakedness gave greater force to the statements of this elderly woman who lived with remorse, guilt, and the grief of not having seen, of still not understanding what had happened. In those final years of reflection and public exposure, Otto Gunga said, "I contented myself with the thought that I personally wasn't to blame and that I knew nothing about the full extent of it all. But one day I passed by Sophie Scholl's memorial plaque and saw that she was born the same year as me and that she had been executed the same year I went with Hitler. At that moment, I felt that being young was no excuse." She died of cancer at the age of 81 on February 10, 2002, 20 years ago. Shortly after the publication of her memoirs and the day after the world premiere of the documentary at the Berlin Film Festival, she had announced, "Now that I've told my story, I can die." Rokus Misch, the bodyguard who accompanied Hitler. Until his last day. Rokus Misch was born on July 29, 1917, in Alt-Salkowitz, a small town in Silesia. Orphaned at a very young age, as his parents died when he was barely 2 years old, he was raised by his maternal grandparents. Amid the poverty of the post-war period and the disintegration of the Weimar Republic, Misch grew up in a deeply nationalist environment, influenced by the economic crisis, post-Versailles resentment, and the promise of redemption offered by National Socialism. In 1937, at the age of 20, he joined the SS Verfügungstruppe, the paramilitary combat organization that would later become the Waffen-SS. He was assigned to the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Regiment, the Führer's personal guard. Although his initial motivation was to serve Germany as a soldier, he soon became entangled in the machinery of the leader's cult. He would later recall, "My first encounter with Hitler was quite strange. I had been in office for 12 days when Hitler's chief aide, a man named Bruckner, started asking me questions about my grandmother and my childhood. Then he stood up and walked to the door. Like a good obedient soldier, I rushed to open it, and there stood Hitler, right behind the door. I felt cold, then warm. I felt every emotion there in front of Hitler. His job, despite being part of a paramilitary force, was Hitler's security, as he would explain in detail. In the Führer's entourage, we were actually bodyguards. When Hitler traveled, 4 to 6 of us accompanied him in a second car, but when we were in Hitler's apartment at the Chancellery, we also had other duties. 2 of us always worked as telephone operators. With a boss like Hitler, there were always a huge number of calls. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Misch participated in the invasion of Poland. During an engagement, he was seriously wounded in the chest. After a long recovery, he was declared unfit for combat and reassigned to security duties. This relocation radically changed his destiny. He was selected to join Adolf Hitler's communications and direct security team within the Führer's headquarters and residences. From 1940, Misch worked as a telephone operator and responsible for the Führer's secure communication lines. His position placed him in a key position. He was the intermediary between Hitler and his generals, ministers, and foreign allies. He decided nothing, offered no opinions, but listened to everything. He knew the voices, the tensions, the tones, and the silences of every important Nazi. From the corridors of the Berghof to the mobile bunkers of the Eastern Front, his presence was an invisible constant. Unlike other members of Hitler's entourage, Rokus Misch was not part of the inner circle, nor did he have direct access to the decisions of power, but he lived among them. He was present in the waiting rooms, in the adjoining rooms, in the command centers. His knowledge of the Führer's routine was absolute. Schedules, temperament, absences, visits, always behind a communications board connected to a network that sustained the regime from the shadows. His loyalty was structural, almost mechanical. He was neither an ideologue nor a fanatic, rather a cog that never hesitated to turn when required. The same chapter. When Adolf Hitler took refuge in the Führer bunker in early 1945, Rokus Misch was transferred with him. His role as a communications operator made him an essential element in maintaining contact with the remnants of the Reich's military and administrative structure. In interviews, the operator stated, "I worked in a small room with a telephone and a teletypewriter with outside lines. Hitler's headquarters in eastern Poland was known as the Wolfschanze. There was only enough room to house one more person in my room in case of an air raid. The bunker wasn't that big. It contained small rooms barely 10 or 12 square meters. From this small room, lined with steel and concrete, Misch controlled the underground telephone exchange that still connected Hitler to his generals, scattered throughout what remained of the Reich. The world was collapsing above ground, but he could still hear voices. The chaos of the final weeks was absolute. The Reich Chancellery was under constant bombardment, the entrances were destroyed, and communications were increasingly erratic. Misch, however, remained at his post, rotating shifts with other operators and technicians. He received and transmitted orders that often no longer made sense, directed at non-existent divisions or commanders who had already died. The remnants of Hitler's inner circle intersected in the bunker's corridors. Josef and Magda Goebbels, Martin Bormann, Otto Gunga, Heinz Linger, General Wilhelm Mohnke, and the Führer's personal secretaries. Misch wasn't part of the decisions, but he was there, always there. He watched, listened, and recorded mentally. His memory was his only archive. In the days before Hitler's suicide, the atmosphere became stifling. News of the Soviet advance was damning, Berlin was surrounded, and surrender loomed as inevitable. On April 30th, 1945, after receiving instructions on his political testament, Hitler locked himself and Eva Braun in his private room. Minutes later, the shot rang out, although Misch, in his own words, was unaware of what had happened. Suddenly, I heard someone shout to Hitler's assistant, "Linger, Linger, I think it's over." They had heard a shot, but I hadn't. At that moment, Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, ordered everyone to be quiet. Everyone started whispering. I was on the phone and made sure to speak louder on purpose because I wanted to hear something. I didn't want it to sound like we were in a death bunker. Then Bormann ordered Hitler's door to be opened. I saw Hitler slumped with his head on the table. Eva Braun was lying on the sofa, her head toward him. Her knees were pressed to her chest. She was wearing a dark blue dress with white ruffles. I will never forget it. Shortly afterward, he witnessed the transfer of the bodies to the garden, the cremation, and the final closure of the Hitlerian cycle. I watched as they wrapped Hitler. His legs were stretched out as they carried him past me. Someone shouted to me, "Come up quickly, they're burning the chief!" I decided not to go because I had noticed that Müller of the Gestapo was there and he wasn't usually around. I said to my comrade Henschel, the mechanic, "Perhaps they'll kill us for being the last witnesses." Misch remained in the bunker for a few more days. He was one of the last to operate the telephone line, trying to establish contact with German units or Soviet officers to negotiate a surrender. Immediately after Hitler's death, Mrs. Goebbels went down into the bunker with her children, Mr. Misch recalls. She began preparing to kill them. She couldn't have done it above ground. There were other people there who would have prevented her. That's why she went down, because no one else could get into the bunker. She went down on purpose to kill them. The children were right next to me and behind me. We all knew what was going to happen, it was clear. I saw Hitler's Dr. Stumpfegger, give the children a drink, some kind of sugary drink, then Stumpfegger went and helped kill them. We all knew what was happening. An hour or two later, Mrs. Goebbels came out crying. On May 2nd, when Red Army soldiers entered the compound, he was captured. Unlike other hierarchs, Rokus Misch was not considered a war criminal. He was interrogated in depth by the NKVD, and his knowledge of internal Reich communications made him a source of strategic information. He was transferred to multiple Soviet prisons and eventually sent to the Vorkuta POW camp in Siberia, where he spent 9 years. In 1954, he was released and returned to West Berlin. There he opened a small painting and wallpapering business. He lived in relative anonymity for decades until in the 2000s he began to receive public attention for having been the last surviving member of the Führer bunker staff. Unlike others, he never showed remorse. In interviews and memoirs, he repeatedly stated that he knew nothing about politics and was simply following orders. In 2006, he published his memoirs, I Was With Hitler, The Last Witnesses of the Bunker. The book caused controversy. In it, he showed loyalty to the Führer until the very end and avoided any moral condemnation of the Nazi regime. For some, it was the voice of an honest witness. For others, an attempt to clear his responsibilities. Rokus Misch died on September 5, 2013, at the age of 96. He was the last survivor of the Führer bunker. His life, like his position at the telephone exchange, was marked by the background noise of power and the final silence of collapse. Later, he would acknowledge that he never questioned the regime, he simply obeyed. His position on the horrors of Nazism was clear. I knew about the Dachau camp and concentration camps in general, but I had no idea of their magnitude. It was not part of our conversations. The Nuremberg trials addressed the crimes committed by the Germans, but we must remember that there was never a war without crimes, and there never will be. During the war years, Misch accompanied Hitler on all his strategic movements, the Western Campaign, the visit to Paris, the meetings at Wolfschanze, the movements between Berlin and Bavaria. He set up communication stations, supervised transmissions, and ensured confidentiality. His name did not appear on documents or speeches, but his role was indispensable. When the war took an irreversible turn in 1943 and the Reich began to lose territory on all fronts, Misch was permanently transferred to the Führer bunker, where he managed the underground bunker's telephone exchange. There he worked under extreme conditions amid desperate calls, suicidal orders, and useless communications with the outside world. His life, like that of the regime he served, was reduced to an echo of wires and static. During those years, Rokus Misch silently witnessed the crumbling power he had served since his youth. He knew the fear of the generals, the anguish of the secretaries, the desperation of the aides, and Hitler's physical decline. But his role was clear: to maintain the connection, even when there was nothing left to connect. Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet who witnessed his end. On April 27, 1945, Hitler called me into his study. The Russians were advancing on Berlin, and even the Führer, normally so optimistic, was beginning to understand that defeat was inevitable. He had isolated himself completely, not wanting to see anyone but Eva Braun and me, not even looking forward to celebrating his 55th birthday. Without preamble, Hitler addressed me. "I would like to hand you over to your family." I interrupted him. "My Führer, I have been with you in the good times, and I will stay with you in the bad times as well." Calmly, he accepted my insistence. "I have another personal task for you. You should have wool blankets on hand in my room and enough gasoline for 2 cremations. I am going to shoot myself right here, along with Eva Braun. You will wrap our bodies in wool blankets, take them out to the garden, and then burn them." "Jawohl, my Führer," I stammered, trembling. There was nothing more to say. Quickly, with my knees about to collapse, I left Hitler alone. 3 days later, he was dead. When I opened the door to Hitler's room, I saw a sight I will never forget. He and Eva were slumped on the flowered sofa. Hitler had shot himself in the right temple. His head was tilted towards the wall and his blood had splattered the carpet. To his right sat Eva, her legs drawn up and her face contorted, betraying the cause of her death: cyanide poisoning. These are the last memories reported by Heinz Linge, Hitler's former valet, who accompanied him until his final days. Linge was born on March 23, 1913, in Bremen. From humble origins and with a technical background, he worked as an apprentice bricklayer before being drawn into the growing mystique of National Socialism. In 1933, shortly after Hitler's rise to power, he joined the SS. His disciplined demeanor, neat appearance, and helpful attitude caught the attention of his superiors. In 1935, he was selected to join the Führer's team of personal assistants. Unlike Otto Gunga, Linge did not come from a purely military background. His role was more domestic, though no less important. He was Hitler's personal valet, responsible for his hygiene, clothing, daily routine, and private spaces. In the rigid structure of the Third Reich, such duties did not imply servitude, but absolute trust. My job was to sort the morning newspapers and early international dispatches, placing them on a chair outside his bedroom. I would wake him at 11. Hitler would get up, collect the mail, and read it in bed, next to which was a tea caddy with books, newspapers, his glasses, and a box of colored pencils. I was responsible for keeping him supplied with writing materials and glasses, as he never liked to be seen wearing them in public, considering it a sign of weakness. I always carried a spare pair of glasses when we traveled, as he would often break them while fiddling with them in his hand, mulling over some problem. Linge was one of the few people authorized to enter Hitler's bedroom unannounced. His role required discretion, silence, and unquestioning loyalty. For more than a decade, Heinz Linge witnessed the Führer's private life firsthand. He knew his habits, his phobias, his obsessions. She helped him dress, organized his belongings, prepared his meals, and was present every moment of the day, even during trips. This closeness made Linge an almost invisible yet indispensable figure. She was even one of the closest witnesses to Hitler's deteriorating health. During the 10 years I knew him, I was constantly worried about his health, and his physical decline began early. At the end of 1942, when the fighting in Stalingrad reached a turning point, his left hand began to tremble. He made great efforts to contain it and hide it from others, pressing his hand against his body or holding it firmly in his right hand. Then, in 1943, he seemed to age almost overnight. By the end of 1944, he moved limply, leaning forward and sideways. If he wanted to sit, a chair had to be placed for him. During the heyday of the Third Reich, Linge participated in official events, banquets, high-level meetings, and diplomatic encounters, always at a safe distance, that is, just one step behind Hitler. He didn't express his opinion, intervene, or leave a trace. His presence, however, was constant. He was a silent witness to the dictator's physical and mental evolution, from the charismatic orator of the 1930s to the paranoid sick man of his final days. Beginning in 1943, with the onset of military setbacks on the Eastern Front and growing Allied pressure in the West, Linge noticed the first signs of Hitler's deterioration. His gait became stiffer, the tremor in his left hand more noticeable, and his temper more irascible. In her memoirs, Linge recalls, "Hitler spoke more and more about the past. His health was deteriorating, and with it his spirits. He began to distrust those around him. In those days, I could not have been more attentive and vigilant, and the Führer, who trusted me implicitly, knew it. He once said, 'Linge, when you sit or stand behind me, I feel safer than if an Obergruppenführer, the highest rank in the SS, were taking your place.'" In Berlin, his birthday, April 20th, was a discreet event, and just 7 days later he told me about his plans to die with Eva at his side. Despite this, Linge did not stray. He was a servant, not a confidant. His loyalty was sealed. When Hitler moved into the Führer bunker in January 1945, Linge accompanied him without hesitation. During the months of confinement, her task intensified. She maintained a Spartan routine, preparing clothes, coordinating cleaning, tidying private spaces, and attending meetings. She was also one of the few who regularly entered Hitler's bedroom and the rooms where Eva Braun was staying. Her closeness to both allowed her to witness the couple's last moments of intimacy. On April 29, 1945, Linge was the one who helped dress Hitler for his symbolic wedding to Eva Braun. That same night, she accompanied him while he drafted his political and personal wills. In these documents, Hitler designated successors and ordered the destruction of his remains to prevent them from being displayed as trophies. At 3:15, I asked for your orders for the last time. With apparent calm and in a low voice, as if sending me into the garden to fetch something, he said, "Linge, I'm going to shoot myself. You know what you have to do." I saluted, and as he took 2 or 3 tired steps toward me, he raised his right arm in the Hitler salute for the last time in his life. I turned on my heel, closed the door, and headed for the bunker exit. Amid the cacophony of Soviet shells, a single pistol shot rang out. His life was over. Mine would never be the same. The next day, April 30th, Ling was standing meters away when Hitler and Eva Braun locked themselves in their private rooms. Minutes later, she heard the shot. Together with Otto Gunga, she entered the room and found the lifeless bodies. Hitler had shot himself in the temple. Eva had ingested cyanide. Following strict orders, Linge and Gunga moved the bodies to the Chancellery garden, doused them with gasoline, and incinerated them. Linge remained in the bunker for several more days, organizing final tasks and destroying documents. Finally, he attempted to flee in disguise through the rubble of Berlin, but was captured by the Soviets on May 2, 1945. In Moscow, he was extensively interrogated by the NKVD. His testimony about Hitler's final days was considered key to officially confirming his death. He spent 10 years as a prisoner in the Soviet Union under extremely harsh conditions. He was released in 1955 and returned to West Germany. Unlike Gunga, Heinz Linge did publish his memoirs. In them, he describes in detail Hitler's daily life, his routine, and his obsessions. He died on March 9, 1980, leaving behind the testimony of a man who lived in the shadows of absolute power until the very end. Otto Gunga, the officer who carried out Hitler's last order. Otto Gunga was born on September 24, 1917, in Jena, in the German state of Thuringia. From a young age, he was a fervent nationalist, and in 1936, at just 19 years old, he joined the Waffen-SS. His discipline, obedience, and academic profile quickly led him to positions of trust, and in 1940, he was selected as one of the Führer's personal assistants. His closeness to Hitler's circle was consolidated in 1943, when he was officially designated his Personlicher Adjutant, the personal liaison officer in charge of coordinating all his logistical, security, and scheduling activities. Gunga was young, athletic, and meticulous, and was constantly present at the Führer's meetings. His duty was to always be at Hitler's direct disposal, receive his personal instructions, and immediately transmit them to the appropriate officials. Not only was he a witness to meetings with generals, ministers, and guests, but he was also responsible for organizing the dictator's daily routine, from train and plane journeys to bunker security. He was wounded several times and earned the officers' respect for his absolute loyalty. Gunga was also present during the July 20, 1944 attack when Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in the Wolfschanze meeting room. He was wounded but survived and remained by Hitler's side until the end. In his memoirs and statements to the Soviets, Gunga detailed the final days of the regime. He was directly responsible for carrying out one of the most symbolic and momentous orders of the 20th century, the cremation of Adolf Hitler's body. On April 30, 1945, after the suicide of the Führer and Eva Braun, it was Gunga who arranged for the bodies to be transferred to the Reich Chancellery garden and coordinated the burning of the remains. In his testimony before the Soviet NKVD, dated 1945, he wrote, "He gave me the order personally. I want my body burned immediately. I don't want the Russians to exhibit it like Mussolini." I assured him that this would be the case, and I did. Along with Erich Kempka and Heinz Linge, Gunga doused the bodies with gasoline and oversaw the burning. He stood by as they burned, performing what he called the last duty of loyalty. When asked why he didn't escape then, he replied, It wasn't possible. My duty wasn't over. I had to make sure the body was reduced to ashes and that it didn't fall into enemy hands. Following this incident, Gunga attempted to escape from Berlin on the night of May 1st, but was captured by Soviet troops on May 2nd, 1945. He was taken to Moscow, where he remained in prison for 12 years until his release in 1956. During his detention, he was extensively interrogated, especially about Hitler's death. The Soviets for years distrusted the suicide story, and Gunga was key to confirming the facts. In one of his reports to the NKVD dated 1946, he noted, "I saw him dead with my own eyes. He shot him in the right temple. Eva Braun was sitting beside him. His body showed no signs of violence. The two bodies were placed together, covered, and then sprayed. There is no doubt that they died there." The value of his testimony was confirmed by other members of the bunker and by Allied investigations. British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who led one of the first investigations into Hitler's death, considered Gunga's statements essential to reconstructing the suicide. In his post-prison years, Gunga avoided public life. He lived discreetly in West Germany, working in private industry. Despite being an exceptional witness, he never published full memoirs. However, he collaborated with journalists and historians on a limited basis. One of them was Joachim Stahler, who obtained direct statements from Gunga in the 1980s. In a private interview cited by historian Ralph Georg Reuth, Gunga stated, "It was not our role to question him. We were there to follow orders. I did not admire him as a god, but as a leader who believed until the last second that Germany deserved more than surrender." Regarding his personal feelings toward Hitler, he said in that same interview, "I didn't cry. I just felt an era was ending. I had shared years of my life with him, day and night. I knew his every gesture, but deep down he was no longer the man of 1940. He was a broken figure." Gunga, who was never tried as a war criminal, also acknowledged that he was unaware of the details of the Holocaust. Speaking to the press in 1982, he stated, "I never heard a direct order about exterminations from him. I knew something was happening in the East, but I didn't have access to that information. We were in the Führer's shadow, but that shadow didn't reveal everything." He died on October 2nd, 2003 in Germany at the age of 86. Until his final days, he maintained the position that Hitler committed suicide and that he, Otto Gunga, carried out the Third Reich's last order with the precision that had defined his entire life as an officer. His figure, even today, is a symbol of the kind of blind loyalty that characterized the last men in the bunker. Young men trained in obedience, trapped in a system where the will of one man was law. Johanna Wolf, the silent shadow behind the typewriter. Johanna Wolf was born on June 1, 1900 in Munich, Germany, into a middle-class family. The daughter of a civil servant, she was educated at a time when women rarely held positions of responsibility in the workplace. At an early age, however, Wolf demonstrated remarkable typing and shorthand skills, which would lead her to become part of the inner circle of one of the most notorious dictators in modern history. In 1929, while working as a secretary in the office of Gregor Strasser, one of the early leaders of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, she was recruited by Rudolf Hess to join Adolf Hitler's personal office. Her efficiency, discretion, and absolute loyalty quickly caught the attention of the future dictator. From then on, Wolf became a key figure in the Kanzlei of the Führers, considered the main secretary of Hitler's inner circle, surpassing even other female figures such as Christa Schroeder or Gerda Christian. For more than 16 years, Johanna Wolf silently witnessed every stage of the rise and fall of the Nazi regime. She typed last-minute speeches, decrees, letters, and dictations amidst bombing raids and high command meetings. Unlike Hitler's other collaborators, she did not become politically involved in the regime's decisions. Her role, although administrative, was absolutely confidential. She never married or had children. Her life revolved around her work alongside Hitler, whom she referred to as the boss. From 1933, Wolf lived in the Reich Chancellery complex and subsequently accompanied her to the Berghof in Bavaria, the Wolfschanze in East Prussia, and finally the Führer bunker in Berlin during the final days of the Third Reich. In her daily dealings with Hitler, Wolf developed an almost ceremonial routine. He dictated while walking or sitting, and she took notes in shorthand, then typed the contents on her Olympia typewriter. She never commented, never expressed opinions, but she listened always. After the collapse of Berlin, she was captured on May 23, 1945, by Soviet forces while trying to escape disguised as a nurse. Although she was not tried as a war criminal, she spent over a year detained in the Ludwigsburg internment camp, where she was interrogated numerous times. She was later released without charge. She never spoke publicly again about her years with Hitler. However, in unpublished interviews and interrogation transcripts kept by the Allies, her words became key evidence for understanding the dictator's daily life. In one of the interrogations conducted by the British in 1945, Wolf described Hitler as a meticulous, punctual, and reserved man. She stated, "He never shouted. Even in moments of greatest pressure, he maintained an almost paternal tone. To us, his secretaries, he was courteous and careful. I never witnessed an outburst in his office nor a bang on the table, quite the opposite of what the world believes. He was methodical to the extreme." Regarding his personal life, she commented, "We spent many hours with him, but he never spoke to us about intimate matters. Sometimes he spoke of his dogs or the Bavarian landscape, always in a melancholic tone. I never saw him smile like a happy man." Elsewhere, when asked if she ever doubted the actions of the regime or Hitler in particular, Wolf replied, "It wasn't our role to judge. We wrote what was dictated to us. He was the Führer, and we were raised to believe in him. The outside world didn't exist within those walls." One of the most powerful statements attributed to her comes from a private conversation she allegedly had with an American interrogator in 1946. "If he asked for something, it was done. But he never asked us to be cruel. I never heard of gas chambers in his presence. If he did know, he didn't share it with us. We lived in a bubble, isolated from the horror." These words have been harshly challenged by historians who argue that even Hitler's closest associates could hardly have been unaware of the magnitude of the extermination being carried out. However, Wolf remained faithful to her account until her death, denying that she had ever known the full extent of the Holocaust. Another valuable source on his thinking was collected by the French journalist Geneviève Tabouy in 1946, who managed to interview some of the regime's female collaborators. Tabouy quotes Wolf as saying, "Adolf Hitler was a man of long silences. He didn't allow out-of-place comments. Everything we did had to seem simple, as if the world weren't falling apart." The figure of Johanna Wolf also appears in the memoirs of Trudel Junge, another of Hitler's secretaries, who describes her as distant, strict, and devoted. Junge wrote, "She was like a shadow of Hitler, always present, always silent. She never expressed an opinion, but she took notes. She was the only one who could tell Hitler that a document was incorrectly transcribed without fear of reprisals." That shows how essential she was. Wolf was in the Führer bunker during the last days of April 1945. She was one of the few women who remained until the 22nd, when she was allowed to leave with other members of the staff. She said goodbye to Hitler in his office, in a moment charged with symbolism, according to her own account. "He shook my hand and looked me in the eyes. He said, 'Thank you for everything, Miss Wolf. You have been more than a secretary. You have been loyal, and that is what I value most.' I felt it was a farewell with no return." After her release, Johanna Wolf disappeared from public life. She lived out the rest of her days in Munich in relative anonymity. She died on June 5, 1985, at the age of 85, without having given interviews to the press or published a memoir. Her name remained indelibly linked to the Nazi dictator's inner circle, but always from a low profile. Erich Kempka, the chauffeur who burned Hitler. Erich Kempka was born on September 16, 1910, in Oberhausen, in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. He was the ninth of 10 children in a working-class family. His father, a miner, died in an industrial accident when Erich was just 7 years old. This early loss led him to seek stability and discipline, which he found by entering the National Socialist milieu during his youth. After training as a mechanic and driver, he joined the Nazi Party in 1930 and was soon after assigned as a high-ranking party chauffeur. His skill behind the wheel, coupled with his unconditional loyalty and reserved nature, led him to become Adolf Hitler's personal chauffeur in 1934, replacing Julius Schreck. For more than a decade, Kempka not only drove the Führer's armored Mercedes-Benz across half a continent, but also became part of the human landscape of Hitler's inner circle. Always uniformed, serious and solicitous, he was responsible not only for transporting Hitler, but also for coordinating a fleet of official automobiles, planning routes, maintaining the logistical security of the journeys, and attending to the head of state's whims. His loyalty made him a trusted, though not intimate, figure for Hitler. Kempka accompanied him on countless trips, from rallies in Nuremberg to trips to the Wolf's lair in East Prussia, including visits to the front or the Berghof. But it was in the final days of the Third Reich that his name would be forever linked to one of the most symbolic acts of the Nazi decline, the cremation of Adolf Hitler's body. In his memoirs, I Burned Adolf Hitler, published in 1951, Kempka offered first-hand accounts of the events that took place in the Führer bunker in 2045 Berlin between April 20th and 30th, 1945. There he described in detail Hitler's final hours, his suicide, and the burning of his body alongside that of Eva Braun. Regarding his daily life as Hitler's chauffeur, Kempka recalled, "The Führer was meticulous, even with the route we took. He wanted to know every possible detour, every alternative entrance in case we needed to escape. He demanded the utmost punctuality, but he was never rude. He was polite, even affable in the calm moments." In another passage from his memoirs, Kempka notes, "He wasn't a man who spoke much to those around him. But I would spend hours waiting for him at the door or driving long stretches in silence. I listened to his monologues, his plans, his silences. Driving him was more than moving the car. It was serving the symbol. Unlike the secretaries, aides like Kempka witnessed Hitler's more irascible temper in his final days." In April 1945, with Berlin besieged by the Red Army, Kempka received precise instructions. He was to secure enough gasoline for the eventuality of destroying bodies. Kempka obtained almost 200 litres, brought in cans to the Reich Chancellery. He never asked what it was for. On April 30th, 1945, shortly after 3:30 p.m., Erich Kempka was summoned by Otto Gunga. Hitler and Eva Braun had committed suicide in the bunker. Gunga, his personal aide, ordered him to help transport the bodies to the Chancellery garden. Kempka and 2 other men wrapped the bodies, carried them up the stairs, placed them in a shallow trench and doused them with gasoline. I will never forget the smell, the mixture of human flesh, gasoline and burning concrete. I threw the match without looking back. I didn't want to see the Führer's face burning. In his testimony to the Allies in 1945, he reiterated this scene. He confirmed that Hitler's body was completely cremated, although he noted that due to the constant bombing, the fire didn't stay lit for long. After several repetitions of the process, only charred remains remained. Referring to his emotional state after the act, he wrote, "I felt no relief, no pride, only emptiness. I burned a man for whom I had worked for more than a decade. He was my boss, but in those days nothing remained of the man I knew, only ruins." Kempka remained in the bunker until May 1st, 1945, when he fled west with other members of his entourage, including Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger and Martin Bormann. He was captured by American forces on June 20th at Berchtesgaden. During interrogations, he provided key information about Hitler's final days and was one of the first sources to confirm Hitler's suicide and the burning of his body. His testimony was considered credible and consistent by British and American intelligence services. Even figures such as Hugh Trevor Roper, author of The Last Days of Hitler, used his words extensively. Despite his key role in the symbolic end of the Nazi regime, Kempka was never formally charged with war crimes. He lived a discreet life in West Germany after its liberation in 1947. In later interviews, he maintained an ambiguous attitude toward the regime. He never renounced Hitler, but he also never expressed political allegiance. In a 1955 interview with Der Spiegel magazine, when asked if he felt remorse, he replied, "I drove, I didn't govern, I didn't make decisions, I did my job." He died on January 24, 1975, in Freiberg am Neckar. His legacy is one of the strangest, a man whose sole job was to drive, yet who ended up playing a direct role in one of the most iconic scenes of the 20th century, the cremation of Adolf Hitler. For many, Kempka was simply the chauffeur. For history, he was the symbolic executor of the act that marked the end of the Reich. Hansbower, the pilot who flew with Hitler until the end. Hansbower was born on June 19, 1897, in Ampfing, Bavaria. His passion for aviation began during World War I, when he served as an aerial gunner and later as a fighter pilot. He was shot down and wounded on the Western Front but returned to flying. After the war, Germany had severe air travel restrictions, so Bauer served as a commercial pilot for Lufthansa on European and transcontinental routes. His skill and professionalism distinguished him as one of the country's best civilian aviators. In 1932, Adolf Hitler flew election campaigns using private aircraft. That year, Lufthansa assigned Hansbower as a pilot for his political tours. Hitler was quickly impressed by his expertise and discretion. Upon assuming the position of Chancellor in 1933, Hitler appointed him his personal pilot and commander of the Führer's Fliegerstaffel, an air squadron responsible for his official flights. From that moment on, Bauer became almost inseparable from Hitler, sharing more than 1,000 flight hours and many full days of work with him. Bauer not only piloted the famous Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor, adapted for the Führer's use, but also coordinated the flight crew, air safety and routes. His loyalty was absolute. Hitler trusted him to the point that during trips he preferred to speak with Bauer rather than with several of his ministers. In his memoirs, published in 1956 under the title I Flew with the Powerful, Bauer offered a humane portrait of Hitler and revealed details of his private conversations. Despite his closeness, he maintained an attitude of admiration without issuing negative judgments. Describing his first encounter with Hitler, Bauer wrote, "He was not what I had imagined. He did not shout. He did not impose. He took my hand firmly and said, 'From today on, your duty is to take me to victory through the air.' I looked at him and knew that my life would change forever." Bauer, a veteran of the Great War and a fervent nationalist, found in Nazism a way to restore German pride. In his role as a pilot, he did not participate in military or political decisions, but he was present at crucial moments: the Anschluss of Austria, the occupation of Czechoslovakia, trips to Rome and Paris, and visits to the Eastern Front. In one of the most talked-about passages in his memoirs, Bauer describes a conversation with Hitler during a flight in 1942. I asked him if he was tired. He looked at me coldly and said, "I will only stop when Germany is completely destroyed or completely redeemed." It was the only time I felt he was speaking from a dimension I did not understand. During the final months of the war, Bauer organized several air evacuation attempts from Berlin. On April 16, 1945, he personally flew from the makeshift Gatow airfield to the Chancellery to inform Hitler about escape possibilities. Hitler refused. In his statements to the Soviets in 1945 and in subsequent interviews, Bauer recounted the dramatic moment on April 29 when he tried to convince Hitler to flee in a small Fieseler Storch. "I told him we could fly low, avoiding Russian positions, and get him out of Berlin. I promised him we could reach the Berghof or some base in the south, but he said, 'I will not leave Berlin. The fate of the Reich is sealed here.' He looked at me and added, 'Thank you, Hans. You are a faithful comrade.'" My legs shook. On April 30th, when news of Hitler's suicide broke, Bauer remained in the bunker, helping to destroy documents and organize the escape of other staff members. He was wounded by shrapnel during the escape attempt and subsequently captured by Soviet forces. He spent more than 10 years in detention in the Soviet Union under constant interrogation, and was one of the last members of Hitler's entourage to be released. During his captivity, he was interrogated by Lavrenti Beria and NKVD officers who were seeking evidence of Hitler's possible escape. Bauer insisted that he had died in the bunker. In one of his testimonies before the Soviets, Bauer stated, "If anyone could have gotten him out of Berlin, it was me, and he didn't want to. He died there. I saw his corpse. He himself ordered it to be burned. He didn't flee. He didn't survive. He died as he had promised." Released in 1955 and returned to West Germany after negotiations between Bonn and Moscow, Bauer was received as a privileged witness to history. However, his figure was marked by ambiguity. He never expressed remorse, and while he was not a war criminal, his personal loyalty to Hitler drew strong criticism. When asked if he still considered Hitler a great man, Bauer replied, "He was my commander. He ordered me to serve him, and I did. I don't regret having been his pilot. What happened next is beyond my knowledge." Hansbower died in Munich on February 17, 1993, at the age of 95. He was one of the last living witnesses to Hitler's inner circle, and until the end of his life, he defended his former commander as someone committed to Germany, albeit tragically misguided. Gerda Christian, the secretary who returned to the bunker. Gerda Christian, born Gerda Daranowski on December 13, 1913, in Berlin, trained as a trilingual secretary in English, French, and German. She entered Adolf Hitler's inner circle in 1937 when she was selected, on the recommendation of Martin Bormann, to join the Führer's team of personal typists, known internally as the Führer Sekretarinnen. Christian immediately stood out for her efficiency, impeccable presentation, and reserved nature. Hitler, who valued discretion above all else in his female entourage, found in her a reliable collaborator. Unlike Johanna Wolf, who had a more institutional character, Gerda Christian knew how to balance her role as secretary with a more personal tone, especially at social gatherings at the Berghof. Her beauty was frequently commented on among members of her entourage, although she was never publicly involved in relationships within the Nazi circle, beyond her later marriage to Eckhard Christian, a Luftwaffe general and member of the High Command. During the more stable years of the Third Reich, Christian accompanied Hitler on his travels both at the Chancellery and at the Obersalzberg residence. She was among the secretaries selected to work in rotation according to strict schedules, given the Führer's habit of dictating documents late into the night. In later interviews, Christian detailed that Hitler dictated from unusual positions, walking in circles, standing by the window, or even stroking his dog Blondie. After the entry into war, she continued in her post until 1943, when she requested temporary leave to marry. She returned in late 1944, at a time already marked by the desperation of the regime. Her return was a personal decision. This is how she described it in her post-war statements. "I knew everything was falling apart, but I felt I had to be there. It was my place. I had worked for that man for years, and it didn't seem right to leave when he most needed loyal people." Christian was present in the Führer bunker from mid-April 1945. In her testimonies, she describes an increasingly oppressive environment where Hitler took refuge in his routines, short walks, repetitive speeches, unrealistic plans for counter-offensives. She, like the other secretaries, alternated between typing orders and sharing last meals with him. Regarding her relationship with Hitler in those days, she said in a private interview in 1954, "He was no longer the man I knew. He was wasted, trembling, his voice breaking. But he still believed he could achieve something, not military victory, but controlling how his world would fall." One of the most disturbing moments she recalled was the writing of Hitler's political testament on April 29, 1945. Christian was present when Trudel typed it from the dictation of Martin Bormann and the Führer himself. Of that day, she said, "He did it calmly, as if signing any other letter. There was no solemnity, no tears, only that obsessive tone of his, of historical justice, of legacy. We knew it was the end, but he wrote for eternity." Gerda Christian also witnessed the wedding of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, held on the night of April 28th to 29th in a small office in the bunker. Regarding that surreal ceremony in the midst of the collapse, she said, "It was strange. They were radiant at times, as if they had freed themselves from everything. She wore a simple dress, he wore his worn uniform, they kissed. Then the shadow returned." After Hitler and Eva Braun's suicide on April 30th, 1945, Christian remained in the bunker for another day. On May 1st, she participated in the last meal of her inner circle before attempts to escape above ground began. She managed to leave the bunker with other women, disguised as medical assistants. She was captured by the Soviets a few days later. During her interrogations, she consistently maintained that she was unaware of the extent of the Jewish extermination. Like Johanna Wolf, she claimed that such matters were never openly discussed in the presence of secretaries. In a 1946 statement, she stated, "We lived to serve him. All we saw were orders, speeches, and meetings. I never saw a concentration camp. I never heard of gas." However, some interrogators found inconsistencies in her account, especially considering that her husband Eckhard Christian had been part of the Air Force High Command with knowledge of logistical movements to the east. Gerda and Eckhard divorced in 1946. They never saw each other again. After being released in 1948, Gerda Christian led a discreet life in Düsseldorf. Unlike other secretaries such as Otto Gunga, she never participated in documentaries or granted interviews to the media. Only excerpts from her official testimonies and a few passages recovered by historians such as Anton Joachimsthaler and Cornelius Ryan are known. The phrase that has resonated most among her few posthumous statements is one she uttered in a private conversation in the 1950s. "I am not ashamed of having served him. I am ashamed of not having asked more questions." Gerda Christian died on April 14, 1997, at the age of 83, thus closing a life marked by silence and closeness to one of the most infamous men in history. Her figure represents those who, without wielding a weapon, were part of the machinery of power by their own choice and remained until the very end, not out of ideology, but out of personal loyalty.